Hey everybody, this isn't exactly a concrete play. We're going to go ahead and talk about fleshing out ideas. I caught the tail of an idea while I was at work, and I figured I'd show you how I take those ideas and I flesh them out before I start to prototype. It's very easy to create a genre game, but there are times when you think of something cool that you'd like to do in a genre game that hasn't really been done before, and there's an instinct to go off and just do it. But you really need to stop and think about how it affects everything. So the idea today is that we have a kind of space engineersy style game where you can build yourself rockets and go places in them and have crews and do things, you know, space engineer style, maybe with a little bit more mission-oriented stuff. Okay, fair enough. And so as a player, your primary goal is going to be to build these kinds of ships and take them around and do things with them. What I'd like to focus on is using other player content. So the idea is we want other players to really want to use your stuff and for you to want to use their stuff. Now in Space Engineers this doesn't really happen. It's very rare for people to download a ship and to put it in their world. They might do it once in a while, but it's never part of their core play. The only time you share content between players is when one player makes a mod or a script, and then those can create new blocks. So if I'm going to have this player's content reused by this player, what I need to do is I need to make it so that we can just take a piece of the ship, like maybe the engines systems, or maybe, you know, the scanning devices or whatever, and make that available. So this player might be like, well, you know, I can put together a ship. I want to go to Jupiter. I don't really want to spend 15 hours trying to tweak the engines, so I'm just going to use this guy's engines because I know they work. And what we'll do is we'll make the front of the ship however I want it to be, and we can just build it however we want, and we can run off and play games with it. Now I'm going to think about this a little bit. I'm going to think about what it means for the game world. I'm going to think about what it means for gameplay, and I'm going to think about what it means for the presentation of the game. This idea of simply sharing systems rather than sharing whole ships, or sharing pieces of ships rather than whole ships, it means a couple of things. First off, it means that we can't really use voxels. Voxels are an inelegant solution when you're going to have overlapping objects. Because voxels, you really have to do a lot of computation to figure out if you can paste them together. It's quite difficult to paste them together, and so on and so forth. So this will be more of a structural thing where you build the structure of the ship, maybe freehand, and there are certain sizes of docking points or welding points, whatever you want to call them, that can be inserted on your ship wherever you'd like. So you're in charge of creating the frame of your ship and the hard points of your ship, and then you can staple on whatever sort of cladding and systems need to go in the various places. And you can build whatever sort of ship you want based on the idea that you're mounting things on these hard points. And since the hard points are freeform, we have a lot more freedom in how we actually hook things up. We don't have to have voxel-shaped everythings. Instead, we can make our things much more organic. Sloped objects are fine when you're doing this sort of thing. So really, this idea has a lot of ways that it interacts with how you are going to design as a player. Because if you're trying to build a ship as a player, this means you're going to have to start by thinking about the skeleton, at least a little bit. Now obviously you could make it so that the player could just drop down like a chunk of skeleton like this, and then build the engines on, and then think about where the rest of the skeleton is going to go. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that it's worth considering rewarding the player for planning out a skeleton ahead of time. Iteration is a big part of these construction games. This is why city building games are so niche. There's not really any iteration there. You get stuck with whatever you build, and then you keep just weathering the changes to the city. But with a spaceship building game, it's important that you use the spaceship and move on to the next one. So therefore, I think one of the core rules would be once you've created the space frame for your ship, it can't be modified, and if the space frame breaks, then your ship is not repairable in any meaningful sense. So you'll draw out your space frame and you'll put in your various hard points of specific sizes, and then you will begin to put your various elements onto your ship. And these elements can be things you build component-wise, and maybe those work in the same way. Like I want to build an engine array of some kind. Well, I can create a sub skeleton which can host those engines, something like this, where we've got tanks here, and then we just have giant arrays here, and then I'll put some cladding on it. We can design it in a couple of ways, right? And we can make it look however we think would be cool. And I think that has a lot of merit to it. It's not as hard as it sounds. It's just it sounds a little bit formulaic even, because you're working with these components that have very specific shapes. It's not as freeform as voxels. But in this day and age, it's very easy for us to twist and morph meshes, so we could just have this in your items inventory, this is a tank. And it's got like a tank hardpoint here and a tank hardpoint here. And you can be like, okay, I kind of like that tank, but I need it to be like this. And it would be very easy for us to programmatically stretch the mesh to fit that shape. So because of that, we can work without voxels. We can work with freeform shapes. This is also handy because it means that any modded blocks we have will be able to fit within that same sort of situation. Just have various size mount points on various faces, and they can be warped. So when you have this idea where the ship is made out of a skeleton that you put systems onto, you can start to understand that you might like to just grab systems off the shelf. It might be fun to build out your whole engine array, but what if you don't care about engines? Or what if your engine array, you wanted to try that super overclocked engine that someone eked out that's got 18,000 moving parts? Sure, just slap it on. You don't need to go out of your way to rebuild it or anything. And same thing with other parts of the ship. If you don't like the sensor array manufacturing because it's got like a whole bunch of energy management and cycling and whatever else, then you can just download one. And if you don't like the cockpits, or if your cockpits just suck and you need to have someone else's cockpits, nothing wrong with grabbing that cockpit and just putting it on your ship. Everything like that, cargo bays, sure, you can go ahead and stick some cargo bays on your ship. More armor? Yeah, sure, have more armor. And you can see how it would be very quick and easy to start to build a ship like this, where you could do just about anything you wanted by slapping pieces onto a skeleton of your own design. And that's a really cool idea, I think. I think that would be enough. The idea of creating a skeleton on your own and then slapping pieces onto it, that would probably be enough to support the game without any other sort of innovation. Just the idea of a frame that you build, and then you can stick systems on it, and the systems can be complicated or they can be simple. And they can be downloaded from the internet, or you can manufacture them brick by brick, out of tiny pieces. All of those things could probably make the game stand on its own. But I like to think about it a little bit further than that. For example, what sort of things can these ships do? In order for you to want to use someone else's system, you have to be able to accomplish something with that package that you couldn't accomplish on your own, or it would be a real pain in the ass. So for example, these cool engines. I can make cool engines on my own, but why would I want to download engines from someone else? Why would I want to use Doug's engines? Even if Doug is a really great engine designer, what do his engines give me that I wouldn't normally be able to get on my own? And if his engines are better than the stock engines, why aren't the stock engines just that? To answer these sorts of questions, you have to start to think about the sort of mission variety you can include and the sort of constraint variety you can include. For example, it may be that Doug's engines are specifically engineered as nebula engines, and as you move through a nebula they work really well, but as you move through other parts of space they don't. Now there are a couple of ways to approach that kind of thing. One way is that you can just offer like a flat penalty, so if in nebula, then damage engines or whatever, do something bad to the engines. But I like to think about it in a little bit more of a physical way, because if you think about it in a way which has physical rules, then the engines can be engineered around those physical rules. So we would like to have trade-offs. If you're pushing through an engine, what's actually happening? You're getting hit from the front by all sorts of dust particles. So maybe what you need is you need an engine that creates a large field to push away those dust particles, a sort of shield, a particulate shield. Okay, well, you could have a particulate shield as an actual object, right? Why would you need it in your engines? Well, I think it would be fun if the particulate shield was a side effect of the engines. So, and I'm just thinking this up on the fly. I didn't plan this out ahead of time, just to show you how I try and think about things. So if you've got like the core engine object, right, and it's some kind of particle accelerator cannon or whatever, it creates this magnetic field, and the idea is that this magnetic field has a secondary effect. It has a small effect as a particle shield. Now, there are times when this particle shield is good, there are times when this particle shield is bad, and there are times when this particle shield doesn't matter. Well, you can tweak the exact nature of the particle shield if we break this engine up into a couple of pieces. Sure, we've got this conduit, but we also have these supermagnets, and the supermagnets are actually around this conduit, and they are what's responsible for accelerating these particles, and they might be what creates the field. By using a different magnet, or by using a different set of parameters on the same magnet, you can shrink the field, you can make the field stronger or weaker, you can make the field oscillate, you can grow the field, obviously, and because of that, you can tune the field to your exact needs. If you're going through, some place where you need to throw off a lot of particles, you might want to have an extra strong shield, and that might mean that you want to use these on a setting that normally you wouldn't use. And because of that, you get, sort of lossiness. You spend a lot of extra power and you don't get very much extra thrust, that sort of detail. On the other hand, if you're cruising through empty space, you don't want to waste a whole lot of power on this. So what you might do instead is you might use, say, a modular system where instead of using one giant magnet, you use, 4 or 6 littler magnets, and in turn produce a much, much smaller field array. But maybe then you need to have a much, much tighter set of controls on those, and you need to have put a lot of effort into having a controller that synchronizes them, which means that you've got like a computer center, and maybe you even have to have code for that, code which you either have to write or get from the station. And then of course that gets wired up, and maybe the magnetic field can interfere with that and put it out on the fritz. So by having this sort of complexity, you can make it arbitrarily modifiable, and you can create all sorts of situations where you might want your engines to do different things. This is especially true if your particulate, or if your shield has other sorts of effects. For example, if you walk through the particulate field, it might actually make your suit go on the fritz, or it might block radio transmissions. There are a lot of other things you can do which would make it so that you would want to avoid having a big one. Or if you do have a big one, you want to make it so that you're either always inside of it or always outside of it. There's a lot of cool little toys, things we can do to play around with that. And that's just the engines. The downside of this is that it's incredibly complex. And you don't want to drive away new players. A lot of players are never going to want to try and balance their engine array with software. Because of that, you risk driving players away. They're like, I don't really understand what this particulate field that they're talking about is. And plus, there's like 8 other things that I have to worry about, like the sensor array. Like, how does a sensor array, how does that work with the particulate field? What do you mean that I have an 80% loss over 1 light year? I really don't understand what you're talking about. It's way too complicated. I'm going to stop playing. To avoid that, you need to do 2 things. The first is you can package this up and just hand it to them. Here is an engine array. This engine array works best in deep space, and it already has controllers attached. You just have to put it on your ship and make sure that you flip the switch when you need to go faster. Great. The other option is when they are building it on their own, we want to give them some kind of pre-packaged simple system. So you build your very first space frame and you're like, oh, this is really cool. I can make my space frame do whatever I want. How awesome. And you're feeling great about it, and you've got all this ports that you've slapped on at random. And what we want is for the new player who's done this to think, oh, this game is really cool, not, oh, this game is so complicated. So what do? We give him a whole bunch of default systems. These can be blocks that you might combine, or they can be standalone prepackaged systems, like the kind that you will download from other players, but the default ones. So you get a simple engine that does something specific that's, it's really shitty, but it doesn't produce a particulate field. And then we have here's a shield generator to produce that particulate field. And here's a armor plating that just fits, automatically around the arms of your ship. And then, here is cargo bays or docking ports or something, where we can put in other things. And then we'll have our living quarters here, and we'll just have a living quarters brick that we can drop in. We can customize it later, maybe go inside it. That would be cool. And then here we'll have our inhabitable area, where we have all of our command features and stuff. And all of that stuff can just be click, sew it in, click, it's in, click, it's in. You don't have to balance anything or set anything up, except for the most minor things that you would need. This allows us to focus on that initial situation. I know that a lot of you probably have played Space Engineers, and you may not even remember that first time when you played it and you were like, I don't understand why I need to put 18 engines on this ship. I don't understand what is a gyro. Why do I need it? I don't really understand how these guns work. I don't really understand anything. There's no shame in that, but I want to minimize it. I want it to be something where a new player can make a functioning ship out of minimalist, just very, very basic interactions. The thing that they are first introduced to is the core of the game, and that would be the space frame that you can twist and bend in any shape you want. And maybe we give them some stock space frames just in case they don't really understand it yet. And then, of course, you can just slot in the systems, and you can be like, okay, well, obviously I'm going to need an engine system. Obviously I'm going to need a place to live, that sort of stuff. And you don't have to worry about the complex things like whether or not there are controllers in your engine array, or whether or not you have a field effect that's cutting your sensor modules in half, or whether or not your cargo bays are the right size for, Class 86 player-generated fighter craft. You don't have to worry about any of that, because it's unimportant when you're first getting started. You should go from zero to ship in a way that feels like you are being super creative and super easy. Very, 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 very low barrier to entry. And of course, you can just download the ship. There are a couple of other details that I like to think about. I like to think about what the actual gameplay is. Now that we've created the ship, it's important that we push the player to iterate on the ship, and there's a couple of ways of doing that. The first is to have a really good fitness test for the ship, and it needs to be a fitness test that is blurry or replicatable or not entirely based on the player. And what I mean by that is you should drop this ship into other people's fitness tests. So if you want to see how well your ship would do in a fight, rather than having to build a target, you should be able to drop in a ship and just fight against it. And because of that, this sort of ship will automatically be, okay, well, let's go ahead and line it up against another ship that has guns, and you can play as your ship, and the NPC will control the other ship, and we'll see how well you fare. That's a fitness test. Another fitness test would be, well, someone else is testing their ship, and your ship was just introduced, and the NPC is controlling it. How well is your ship doing? That's also a fitness test, and you'll get a report back. Oh, so-and-so did this. You can see a replay here. But fights aren't the only fitness test. Missions of all sorts are important fitness tests. How well does this land on a planet? How well does this go through a nebula? How well does this support 18 crew members for 3 years straight? How well does this repair other ships? How good is this at medical stuff? There's an infinite number of possible missions, and I think it is worthwhile to spend a little bit of time thinking about them. The most important thing to realize about these missions, though, is that they're going to mix and match constraints, they're going to mix and match mods, and they're going to mix and match goals. For example, this ship might eventually evolve into a medical ship that drops off medical ships. Like it's a hospital ship, and the idea is that those cargo bays are full of smaller ships that can go down to the surface of a planet and perform medical rescue. Great. you need to have the flexibility to allow a player to do that. You don't necessarily have to automate it, and you don't necessarily have to have the concept of, you know, a diseased planet, but you have to be able to let them mock it together. You have to be like, okay, there is a planet down there, and you can go ahead and set down, you know, NPC dummy bodies, and those, if you would like, you can treat those as if they were ill people. Maybe you can set values on them, and we can say, okay, yeah, their sickness equals 100. You know, you can go ahead and let them mock it up together, and then the modders will be able to pull that together into a rather good framework and have a lot of fun with it. But the starter people don't have to ever realize it exists. They can just futz around until they get the picture. The other thing is the UI for choosing different components from different players. I haven't really thought about that yet, but it has to be surfaced in a way where if you pick one, you still see the options for the others, so that you will feel like you want to try to use those other options later. So if you're looking for, you know, control, if you're looking for an engine that's really, really good at nebulas, Nebula engine, even if you immediately find it or you have it favorited, you should also see Nebula Engine Controller as an option over here, which is like a programming thing rather than an engine. And down here you should see Nebula Warper, which is a tool that takes the space dust in a nebula and turns it into a weapon, or maybe burns it for fuel or something. And then over here you've got like the RAM scoop, Nebula RAM scoop. And all of these things will trigger in your head, and you'll see like a little bit of text. Blah 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 blah, and you'll be able to go, oh, I only want this Nebula engine today, but this, I'm gonna want that. I'm gonna want to put that in my next ship. I want to build a ship around that concept, and I think that that's important. I think that the concept of helping the player figure out what kind of missions and constraints they want to tackle would be fun. Here's another one, you know, Fire Nebula. It's a place that you can stick in your world, in your universe. So that's the sort of way that I flesh out these kinds of ideas and start to think about how they would be in a prototype. I think about all of the ways that I can make the unique things feel very unique. I think about the things that a player can do in my game that they wouldn't be able to do in any other game. And I try and think about the way I can lower the barrier for people to discover those things that they can do in my game that they can't do in any other game. The idea is, if someone stops playing your game before they discover what makes your game cool, you have done them a disservice. It doesn't matter whether or not they still paid you, or even if they give you a good review. If they haven't reached what your game is best at, then you have not given them the experience that you could have. So I always try and think about, how can I bring in the player all the way to the heart of what my game is good at? Anyway, you can think about this sort of stuff forever. For example, you can easily change it so that instead of being ship-focused, it's crew-focused, and it's sort of like The Sims in space, and then your missions are things like how much of different kinds of stresses are put on your crew when you go to Mars versus landing on Pluto or whatever. There are an infinite number of options here, but you have to think about it carefully and try and figure out what makes your game special and how to introduce your player to that as efficiently as possible. That's it.